At that time, when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus, and came up behind him in the crowd, and touched his garment. For she said, "If I touch his garments, I will be made well." And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked round to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, and fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But he put them all outside, and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha, cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. He strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord. Dear brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ, we are all called by our life of faith to become evangelizers. And as I was reading this Gospel passage of today, I was just amazed at how these two individuals or families that are touched by the Lord in today's Gospel passage would have had a change of mindset from the time they had their own personal encounter with Jesus. Here were two families in need, so to say, or two individuals in need, Jairus and the woman with the flow of blood. And they approached Jesus with a faith that moves mountains. And after their experience of Jesus, how would their perspective on life had changed? We see around them people who are a part of the crowd, even apostles, who are just following Jesus, maybe out of curiosity to see what he will do, maybe with excitement about this possible Messiah who is going to rule Israel. But there are two people in the gospel passage who come with a very personal need to Jesus, with a heart filled with faith. And it is these two individuals, Jairus and the woman with the flow of blood, who touch Jesus' heart. and draw power from his robes and from his words and from his actions. What kind of Christians are we? The one who follow Jesus as the crowd out of curiosity, not really sure what to expect from Jesus? Or are we those people like Jairus and the woman with the flow of blood who approach Jesus with a faith-filled heart, filled with expectations that with Jesus great things can happen? Pope Francis, in his first apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, says that all of us are called to be spirit-filled evangelizers, filled with the joy of the gospel, knowing that Jesus is with us. And he says that we will not continue to evangelize unless we have one particular conviction. And I cannot put it in any better words than his own. And so I quote from 266, the paragraph 266 from his exhortation. He says, "It is impossible to persevere in a fervent evangelization unless we are convinced from personal experience that it is not the same thing to have known Jesus as not to have known him. Not the same thing to walk with him as to walk blindly. Not the same thing to hear his word as not to know it. And not the same thing to contemplate him, to worship him, to find our peace in him as not to. It is not the same thing to try to build the world with his gospel as to try to do so by our own lights. We all know well that with Jesus, life becomes richer, and that with him it is easier to find meaning in everything." Dear brothers and sisters, in the first reading, we saw a king who tried to build his kingdom, sometimes without God, and the tragedy that occurs in his life as his own son Absalom turns against him and eventually loses his life. David learns a hard lesson, that it is impossible to build a kingdom without the blessing of God. And he learns it very late in his life. But what about you and me? Are we trying to build our own life apart from Jesus? Do we realize that he comes to give our life meaning, to fill our hearts with a love that the world cannot give? It is that which we receive in the Holy Eucharist every day, a gift beyond measure. As we receive him in spiritual communion today, let us ask for that experience that teaches us how Jesus makes all the difference.